Okay, so it's 10:02. We'll make a start, and we can let anyone in who's straggling a little bit. So, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining today's session. I'm Sean Gibb. I'm the Events and Marketing Manager at Pro Manchester, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Property 2022 Customer and Marketing Innovations, hosted by Mackin, founder at TheEword. Following today's session, I'll send out a post-event email which will contain any post-event collateral, links to where you can find out about other upcoming Pro Manchester events, and also our feedback form. It would really be useful if you could, it's like 4 questions, it's like a 1-minute job. If you could just click on that and fill in the feedback form, it really does help us. And crucially, the last question, which I always think is the most important, is your ideas for what you'd like to see on future events. So it really does help us whenever Pro Manchester members are looking for a steer on what to do their events on. It's nice to be able to look back on the feedback and say, well, this is what people really want to see. So thank you for taking the time to do that. Just a couple of points of housekeeping. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded. Feel free to use the chat function to ask any questions, make any comments, observations, and also you can use the raise your hand feature if you'd like to come off mute at that time when Al invites you to, and then you can ask any questions to him directly. But just please keep your microphones on mute for the time being. And without further ado, I'll hand you over to Al.
Thanks, Sean. So welcome everyone to today's session. The aim of the session is to talk about some of the innovations in marketing and customer experience that we think are going to be really important into 2022, which sounds like a long time away, but realistically it's just 7 months. So there's plenty of time to be thinking about how do we change as businesses, what do we deploy, and how do we set ourselves up for the best year in 2022. So today's session is going to be roughly 45 minutes with 15 minutes at the end for questions. I'll give a short intro to myself and then we'll get stuck into some of the great technologies, concepts and platforms that I think are going to be critical. And I'll leave you with one thing at the end, which is an approach to deploying technology that can make that process easier from a deployment side, but also from a budget and business acceptance side. So a little bit about myself. I'm the founder of an agency called TheEword, also a founder of a startup called Zuko, and more recently a property startup called rebrix. We've been working in the property sector for 8 years now, so across residential, PBSA, commercial and investment. And I put down here that I love property, which I think should probably expand on. What we love is the complexity of the challenges in property. And property is such a huge considered purchase or lease, whether it's a home or whether it's an office. And it's not only a functionally big decision, it's also an emotionally big decision. So even an office space, which seems quite business-like, the decision you make will be led partly by emotions. The way that you think that you're going to feel being in that office, and all your staff are going to feel. And we just find that kind of challenge fascinating, because as we talk through today, you'll see how we approach kind of playing on those emotions that people have. So we work with lots of different businesses over the course of our agency. You'll see some big property companies on there that we've supported at various times, and all sorts of other clients and industries as well. So I wanted to start by talking about the buying cycle. So a buying cycle is a way of looking at an individual and all the different stages they move through, from being aware of your organization to actually becoming a lead and then a customer and having value attached to them. And this is the type of typical buying cycle that you'll see. It's a good approach to breaking down individuals and thinking about the different stages, how we target individuals at those stages, and what type of messaging we use to bring those people to our websites or to our businesses. And this is the type of buying cycle that you can use for almost every type of marketing challenge, whether it's B2B or B2C. So at the start, is an individual who has no understanding of you or your brand or business. And as they move through it, they become interested in what you do. They start to seriously consider you as a solution provider, whether it's B2B or B2C. They move to intent, where they are ready to commit to you, and finally to sale, where you can start to book them in as revenue. The challenge with this is that because the property buying or leasing process is so considered, there are a lot more sub-stages to it than just these obvious 5. So what we do as an agency with every client that comes in is we build a custom buying cycle for that particular client. And what we see is completely different buying cycles for commercial versus residential, and even different buying cycles for different residential developments in different parts of the country. So this is an example residential property buying cycle. So the first thing you'll notice is there are significantly more stages than on the previous slide. And the reason we've done this is because we know that there are far more key pain points and key decision points for a customer that's buying a home than the 5 stages that we would normally look at. And as well as splitting it into the 14 stages, we also analyze each stage and understand the likelihood that individual would consider our client at that point, our ability to target that individual effectively, which is the column marked out of 20, and also the conversion strength, so the ability to convert them, and the awareness strength, the ability for us to impact on their decision-making process by making them aware of our client. And what this does is, it's not about scaring you, it's not about suddenly making a process infinitely more complex. It's about zooming in to particular stages and thinking about how you target the person at that stage and what messaging will actually appeal to them. So the type of messaging you deploy at stage 7 is fundamentally different to stage 1, because the individual has different wants and needs, different problems that you need to solve. The likelihood to consider increases as the individual gets to a point where they're close to filtering potential solutions in. And then it decreases towards the end, because unless that person is locked into you as a supplier, they're far less likely to consider you because they're obviously looking at someone else. So why go to this effort and build this really deep understanding of the buying cycle? Ultimately, it's about better targeting and better messaging. So rather than a one-size-fits-all approach to your ad campaigns and your emails and the things you push out, instead, you're really considering what stage is a customer at and what messaging would be most appropriate to them. So you can pinpoint the challenges, the concerns, the desires that a customer has. And by doing that, you're going to speak to them and they're going to be more bonded to you as a brand. It also means that you've got a greater likelihood of attracting the lead to you. So it's not just about drawing the customer in and having them visit the website or the brand. It's also about bonding them to you and that bond remaining throughout the buying cycle. And if you can generate that warmth at that point in the process, that warmth remains and means that they're more likely to convert. And ultimately, it's about greater efficiencies. So it's about having resource that's more focused and also less wasted ad spend. So rather than hitting a market of 100,000 with the one-size-fits-all message, you're breaking that market down into chunks. You're really focusing on the individuals who have particular challenges or at certain points, and then you can get more efficiencies in your ad spend. I just wanted to sort of end that section by talking about what we've seen that's changed in the last year. And obviously, technology is changing the way that people buy homes and rent offices and all sorts of things. But with COVID, there's been a huge shift in the way that people have done things. So we've seen an increased focus from our clients on digital. So more virtual viewings and much stronger capabilities around delivering experiences online, because the experience, can't be delivered offline, or if it can, it's a lot less valuable. Within our clients, we've seen a greater demand for technology. and ultimately less fear around technology. There's a realization that technology is needed and required. It's something that has to come in, if not just for the next year, but for forever. And there's certainly more, but not quite enough resource moved into integrating new solutions. What's also been really interesting is we've seen more, but not quite enough chatter around customer experience. And I'll come back to CX later in the presentation. We've also seen a big move away from what we call old school offline. So things like advertising on buses or trams or things like that. And of course, the challenge was there was no market for that during COVID. People weren't out. There was no point in putting money into those things. So there's been a much greater likelihood of trying new things in digital. So new digital channels or tactics or technologies or things like that. And ultimately, I think people have moved away from this idea of if we can just get people into the building or the marketing suite, then we can convert them. And instead it's moved to if we can get them to feel their new home or their new office. So there's something that's really important to us as an agency, and that's discovery. So discovery is all about understanding your customers. When we work with a new client, even if we know that sector, even if we know that subsector in that particular part of the country or that type of asset, we always start afresh, and we run an interactive, engaging process with our clients to really dig into who is their audience and what are the hot buttons for that audience profile. So what turns that audience on? What's important to them when they're thinking about buying from our client? And internally, if you're thinking about running a discovery process for your business, I think one of the real challenges of doing that in a business is that there's always a belief that we know the customers and we know the industry. But over time, the market changes. The profiles that you have, the audience profiles, mix and merge. And also the channels change. The new ones start to appear. So what was a solid understanding of customers 2 years ago is now not as sound. So when we run a discovery process, it typically takes 12 hours. And at the end of that is a 3-hour discovery session. So this is an interactive session. It draws in as many stakeholders and parties as possible. It's enlightening. And when you say to people, we're going to do a 3-hour session, I don't think many people smile and say, wonderful, I love those 3-hour meetings. So we put a lot of effort into making it as engaging and interesting as possible. But what we find at the end of it is the individuals who've taken part come away, even from the session itself, having learned more about their own customers and the business. And it's all about unearthing new information and reminding everyone in the business of the critical information around their audiences and their customers. Every business has a lot of data, but some of the most powerful data that exists in a business is not within databases and spreadsheets. It's in the heads of the individuals who have worked in that business for a long time. But that data is not easy to access. It's not something you can just log on to and gain value from. So the discovery session is about unearthing that data and centralizing it, and then using that data to build insights and a strategy from. And there's a lot of different steps in the discovery process. So I've picked out some of the ones that I feel are most important. And we always start with the why. So what do you do as a business? How do you do it? And why do you do it? And ultimately, when you start this process, you get very functional, sensible, almost reticent answers to it. And when you keep pushing on it, that's when you start to get valuable information. So for an example, let's say you're an accountant, you might initially say, look, we do accountancy, we do it by being good accountants. And the reason why we do it is because we're all trained accountants and it's kind of obvious to us. When you keep pushing at it, what you'll start to get is actually what we do is we make our clients' lives significantly easier. We take on all these complex accountancy tasks, which our clients hate, and we do a really good job of it. The how is we have an amazing team. So we hire people who have worked in-house. So they have that kind of exposure to businesses and entrepreneurs. And actually the why we do it is we get really happy when we take this work off our clients and we save them time or we help them with complex financial situations. So you can see on that journey, we've gone from the very functional, which sounds quite boring, to actually a place where you could potentially use some of those concepts in marketing. Another thing we look at is the functional and the emotional benefits for a customer using you. So the functional is, if we go back to the accountants, the functional is we make your life easier by doing your accountancy. And what that means is we make our clients' lives easier. So the emotional benefits for a customer are they feel happier and they are allowed to do more things in the business that they want to work in. So that's the emotional benefit that people feel. And it's important to tap into these emotional benefits because that's what drives people's decision making. So if you can tap into how you make your customers feel, how you're going to make their lives better, that's the thing that really drives their decision-making process. And then we ask our clients to think through what we call an elevator pitch. So we use that sentence that's highlighted there. And we ask them to fill in, who are your target customers? Who are they dissatisfied with? What is the market alternative? What is it that you do that's different? And how are you unlike that market alternative? And I'll show you some great examples in a couple of slides. We also ask our clients to think about the core audiences. So there's some really obvious ways to define these audiences. The socio-demographic, so age, sex, job title, and geographic. But there's some really interesting ones around the traits that the audience has and the behavior, so the way that they behave as buyers. And when you start breaking down your audiences and building out audience profiles, and most businesses end up with sort of 3 or 5, the socio and the geographic are really helpful around the targeting of ads. So if we're going to show ads in a certain place or to a certain group of people, how do we define that? But the behavioral and the psychographic are really interesting for the messaging that you have within the advertising. So what's important to each different audience type, and therefore what will they connect to and ultimately drive them towards us as a business. So I mentioned the elevator pitch before, and I put 2 examples down. One is for an example business that rents offices. Another is for a home builder. So the example for the office rental business is for office renters who are dissatisfied with traditional renting. Brand X is a next generation property company that provides high levels of customer service and customizable office space. Unlike traditional office providers, our service is built for the modern business. Now, this elevator pitch doesn't have to go anywhere. It's not about building a new tagline for the website or anything that ever appears in marketing collateral. It's about having a sentence that reminds the marketing team and potentially the teams beyond it why you exist, why you're different, and why people would choose you. And even in that single or multiple sentences, I've pulled out some of the words that could actually move into marketing. So next generation property company, high levels of customer service, customizable office space, built for the modern business. So even in that simple approach and those few sentences, we've been able to pull out snippets that could make their way and bubble up into the marketing. And it's the same for the home builders. The sentences in there that you could pop into marketing, you could start applying them to some of the audiences, and they could eventually be the really hot buttons that drive people to your brand and they start the journey with you. So the outcomes of the discovery process. I mentioned the 12 hours. So the initial kind of 9 hours is around doing desk research before you run your discovery session. After the discovery session's complete, you'll end up with a document that's been created while the discovery session goes on. And all of the data you have in that leads to your strategy document. So that's where you take all of that insight and then you turn it into a strategy that you can move forwards with. And the strategy includes the channels, the type of messaging, when you'll do things. It's a blueprint for what you believe you need to do based on the insight from the discovery. It'll give you a clear understanding of who your target audiences are. What do they look like? What's important to them? And how do you target those as individuals? It also really sets out what sets you apart as a business. What makes you unique? And I think having that in any business and something that you can remind yourself of, make sure that your messaging in years 2 and 3 is aligned to what you learned in year 1. And finally, what are the hot buttons and the key messages? So the great thing about marketing is you often have a blank canvas. You can say whatever you want. You can put in whatever images you want. But the challenge with that is, what do you say and what do you put in that will align with the strategy and help you get those customers? So from the discovery process, you have those hot buttons and key messages that you can align. And ultimately, why you exist as a business is often why customers will choose you. So that passion that you had or someone else had for starting the business, that's why people want to work with you. And if you can bubble that up into the marketing, that's where you get that emotional connection to potential customers. Every business has data. Every business uses analytics platforms. And I was going to ask for a show of hands, but obviously I can't see anyone at the moment. If you wouldn't mind using the raise your hand functionality to just help me answer this question. Do you use an analytics platform at the moment, or have you ever been exposed to it, like Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics? If you just wouldn't mind pressing the raise your hand functionality. Awesome. Thank you very much for being interactive on today's session. So I think in most businesses, people get that kind of exposure. And you get access to all these big platforms that bubble up data and give you a ton of metrics. The challenges with data are significant, and as significant as data itself. So every business has too much data. So too many metrics, too many reports, too many things you can look at. And this leads to a number of different, but ultimately quite significant challenges. So as human beings, we can sometimes seek refuge in unimportant metrics. What I mean by this is everyone has KPIs. When those KPIs are not great, we will look at other numbers and feel happy about where we're at because those other numbers are positive. So rather than focus on KPIs, we're looking at PIs. The more data we have, the more reporting overhead we have. So when we get exposed to more metrics and more sources of data, there's more reports produced, and those reports become, greater in length. And ultimately, the more data we have, the less reading that we do. If you get a single report on a weekly basis, which has 2 slides and 6 metrics, you're far more likely to read that and engage with it than a spreadsheet that has hundreds of rows and 15 tabs. And ultimately, the less you read, the less you absorb, and the less you can take action on the data that you've got. And there's a belief that more data leads to more insight. Insight is not driven by sort of width of data or size of data. Insight is the process of taking data and turning it into actions and outcomes and things that can be achieved. That can be achieved with less data. It's not the same if you have more data, that it means you have more accurate or you have more insight. And what we've seen with clients is that there's always expansion of data and reports. Let's just add this metric. Let's see if we can work out this number. And ultimately it becomes unwieldy and it reduces the value of the reporting you can get from it. What we would suggest is focusing on 3 metrics per area. So if you're within a marketing team in a property company and you need to produce reports for 3 different teams, so the sales team, the marketing team itself, and the C-suite. Pick out the 3 metrics that are most important to those areas. If you're currently reporting on 50 or 100 or something that's significant, you may find that those teams are actually really open to reducing the number of metrics that are being reported on, because they themselves have become frustrated with the volume of data. If you're using a platform like Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics or similar, one of the great things about that is you can give access to that to other members of the business. The challenge with that is that it's such a large and sometimes unwieldy platform that it can become a time hog for that individual. And for a lot of people, they're exposed to so much data and reporting that they can't make any sense from it. So we've seen some brilliant results from not allowing our clients to use GA, but instead using Google Data Studio or similar, and taking all of those metrics and condensing it into reports that are really focused. And I'll show you some examples of that in a couple of slides. I think having or getting the most value from data is about being really protective over the metrics and actually setting out limits on who can adjust the data. So if there's a report, setting a hard limit on only specialists or analysts being able to add metrics into it is something that becomes really valuable. And really the difference between Google Analytics and Google Data Studio is from what you can see on the screen today, which is an example report, to that is a example GDS report that we produce. So it's very focused. There's still significant value in it, but the ability to read and understand and absorb that data and actually see trends from that data is far, far easier. So I wanted to briefly touch on influencers. And for some of you, your hearts will sink when you hear that word. I think influencers have, in some cases, a bad rep, but it's worth talking about the different flavors of influencers. So the influencers that you sometimes see in the paper selling, questionable diet pills, they're the mega influencers. They're the individuals who have followers in the millions. They're the ones that you can see on the beach in Dubai with a Ferrari next to them. What's really interesting is when you move down the sizes of influencers and you start to look at what we call the nano or the micro influencers. And actually, some of the people on today's call may already be nano influencers. It's 1K to 5K followers. So if that's you, congratulations. The reason why micro and nano are really interesting to us is because the audience they have is significantly different from mega. The way you engage with them and the way they can support you is also significantly different. So again, we're going to ask you to be interactive in this session. Could you give me a show of hands if your trust in influencers has changed over time? So when you see an influencer, when you read the posts that they put, do you feel differently now than what you would have felt, say, 3 or 4 years ago? Are you more or less distrustful of influencers and what they're saying? Do you believe that the things that they're saying are true and you should, sort of move forwards with that as a truth? So thank you for raising your hands. I think that when we look at influencers today versus 3 or 4 years ago, there is a significant difference in the way that they sort of deal with things, the way that they market themselves, the type of things they talk about. What I really like about nano and micro influencers is that they have a niche. So there's a particular area that they are specialist on or talk about or share. And because of that, they have an audience that is more trusting of their opinion on that. And in property, what we find is that there are individuals who have a small but powerful following who tend to trust those individuals on the topic of area. So area could be a city or a part of a city. And that would cover things like things you can do, buildings, architecture, and things like that. And that means there's a captive audience from those nano and micro influencers who you could potentially tap into. The way you engage with them is significantly different from the mega influencers. The cost is less, sometimes zero, but the effort shifts to you as the client or the agency. And building that community can take time, but the rewards to nano influencers are less around money and more around things like access, content, and exclusivity. Ultimately, your amplification is much smaller, but you can get a different type of value from nano and micro influencers. They can act as sounding boards, they can give you advice, and suddenly it's a different layer of value that you can achieve from them. So I wanted to talk about, so I'll start digging into technology. So virtual agents is something that we've been deploying for our clients. Let me tell you a little bit more about what I mean around virtual agents. So on the screen on the left-hand side, you can see an example of what we call a virtual agent. It looks like a live chat or a chat box, but it's actually a machine learning driven process. So you're not talking to a human being, you're talking to a really intelligent computer. What it does is it allows an individual to have a conversation at any time of day, any day of week. It allows questions to get answered, and in some cases really deep questions at any time of the day. But the responses are microseconds rather than hours or days with emails or telephone calls. And it can also do things like setting up viewings, setting up callbacks. And ultimately, it never has a bad day. It's never too busy to respond quickly. So what we like about this technology is it gives us coverage, or gives our clients coverage whenever a client has a question. And the responses are really quick, and the customer doesn't have to fill in a form, because customers hate forms. And one of the challenges around forms, especially in property, is when you fill in a form to say, I'd like more information, or I'd like to set something up, it's sometimes difficult to know, well, what happens next? When will I get a response? Will it be one business day? Will it be 3 days if I'm asking a question late on a Friday? You know, what is the next action on your side? And if we take a step back and look at sales agents, what are the gaps in having an agent? Well, sales agents are like, you know, any human being. They have to sleep and spend time with their family. They really only have an 8, 9, 10-hour window of the day, 5 days a week when they can have conversations. There's also a wide range of skills and their ability to care and attend to clients. So some sales agents are outstanding, some are good. Sometimes they have good days, average days, bad days, and they're often, overworked, or they have periods of being overworked or extremely busy. One of the questions that we kind of asked when we were looking at this technology was, is it the best use of agents' time to be answering lots of questions at the start of a buying funnel? Could we instead focus their time on the mid stages of the funnel? So all of the questions that buyers or renters have, wouldn't it be great if technology could respond to that, but in a human-like fashion? So we see these intelligent machine learning driven chatbots as being better than those kind of pick an option chatbots where you go on and it simply says, would you like to do one of these 3 things? And we also see that as being better than a live chat. So in theory, live chat is amazing, speak to a human being. The reality is it's difficult to have it manned at all times. And also it's difficult to man it outside of office hours. And ultimately, the faster you can get responses to a client, especially in the early stages of an interest process, the faster they can choose to filter you in or out. So we'll have questions where the answer will mean that you become a credible business for them, or they think, okay, that's not going to work for us, so we're not going to have you as part of our buying process. And that's functional rather than emotional. Equally, some customers don't want to pick up the phone. We're moving into a place where almost all of the things we do are done online. The majority of that are done without speaking to a human being. And we see that being replicated, in the property sector. There's no more kind of challenges around overworked sales teams or office hours. And the virtual agent that we deployed is self-checking and self-alerting. And what we mean by that is, if, for example, someone sets up a viewing, the agent will check in with the individual who set up the viewing to make sure that it took place via SMS. If that viewing hasn't taken place and the customer says, no, it didn't, and I'm unhappy, we'll then alert stakeholders in our client to ensure that that gets flagged and rectified. So I just wanted to give you some data around the virtual agents that we've deployed, and this is anonymized data for one particular virtual agent. So it's actually been really busy and had over 5,000 conversations, of which 96% are what we call fulfilled. So fulfilled means the virtual agent believes it can give a good response to a client's question. I mentioned speed, and the average response time is less than a second. And what was really interesting is we saw just over 65% of conversations took place outside of office hours. So these are potentially conversations that would have ended up being a form without a response for 1 or 2 days, or potentially conversations that wouldn't have taken place at all. And what we've also seen is that almost a quarter of sales leads are now coming via the virtual agent. We can also analyze the conversations that take place and look at the sentiment of the conversations. So the sentiment is, are the words that the individual is putting into the conversation positive, neutral, negative, or mixed? And actually what we found was that almost all of them are neutral, which we kind of would expect at the start of the funnel, where it's very functional in terms of the questions being asked. You can glean a lot of data from those conversations. It's not just about satisfying people's demand for questions outside of office hours. It's also about thinking about, well, what are they asking? And can we use that data in other parts of the business so we can see the type of topic that the question was. And we can also build a word cloud based on the words that are input by the user, which is again quite interesting from a marketing point of view to see, what are people discussing the most. I wanted to talk about automation as well. So automation is this process of taking manual marketing tasks away from human beings. It's about also deploying complex chains of communication that are based on what a human being does. And they're so complex that it would be almost impossible for that to be replicated manually. A really simple example of automation is a user fills in a form and confirmation is emailed to them. The aims of automation is simply to reduce effort from the teams, releasing resource, so on both the sales and the marketing side. It's about increasing comms with clients without having any additional effort, and it's about decreasing the position of you and the client, so bringing you much, much closer together. And if we take a step back from automation, what we're trying to do is replicate the ideal sales agent. So if we think about an amazing sales agent, they want to be in regular contact with customers. They remember everything that the customers said, and they tailor their messaging to that customer and that data. And they know everything that the customer does, and they engage the customer based on those actions. A really great sales agent is also more likely to change the contact method to the customer. So if they're not getting responses via email, let's switch to SMS or let's switch to phone. And you can set up automation now. There are platforms out there that do a really good job of it. The way we see automation in the future is actually the way you use that platform. So sending static email cadences saying, okay, here's 4 emails we want to send every single lead is not going to be enough. Customer and agent personalization is key. So having the ability to customize and personalize those messages to each customer based on what they want, and also having those messages coming from the agent themselves. Delivering that across multi-channel, so not just email, but also SMS and virtual agents, and also it being data-driven. So not about every single lead gets the same kind of cadence, but let's adjust the way we engage with customers based on the data that we have around them. And it's also about building out lots of different messages to cater for all sorts of different situations, and being able to kill automation or switch it based on something the user does. So if you've got automation that sends emails and SMS out based on a customer being an early stage lead, when they move away from being an early stage lead, you want to stop that cadence because those set of emails are not going to cater for that individual. So a couple of examples, I'll just go through one of them, and obviously we'll share the slides afterwards. example one of a really great automation process is around generating more leads. So when a cold lead, someone who's been engaged with you but then defined as someone that's gone cold or is dead, when they engage or re-engage with the platform, let's create an automation that will aim to bring them back into the business. So when they re-engage with the website or the development they were looking at, and it's less than 2 months since they went cold, let's send them a personalized email from the sales agent that previously handled them. And let's reference in that email the property they were previously interested in. So they recognize the name of the individual, the subject of the email references the property that they've already learnt about, and there's going to be a greater chance that they will open that email and engage with it because of those two things. That's a simple level of personalization, but it's something that we don't really see happening at the moment. And yet that will have such a big influence on their ability or the likelihood that they would open the email, but also the likelihood that they would respond to it. What we're also seeing is a shift from these beautiful but very marketing-like emails where it's graphics and text to actually emails where it looks and feels like someone has handwritten it themselves. The response rates are higher, people are far more likely to engage with it because they think another human being has sent it, and therefore they have a desire to respond to that human being. So what we see when we deploy great marketing automation is significantly higher open rates. You know, whether it's that example that I showed you before, if you can make the subject line stronger and a stronger fit for that individual and their needs, there's a much greater chance that they will open it, and that then leads to higher click-through rates. What we've also seen through that is that automation is starting to appear in the top 5 last clicked lead sources. So for our clients, we look at the channels that deliver the most leads. Last click attribution is where you look at the channel that happened to be the last one in all of the list of sources. And apologies for the beeping that you might be able to hear in the background. What that does is it takes automation from being a nice to have, we think it's useful, yes, it sounds great, to actually a really valuable technology that is a key part of the marketing mix. And that really kind of helps us when we're looking to expand that platform and do more with it, and that needs resource and budget from the client. So there's been a lot of talk, perhaps not enough, but good volume, and it's nice to see growth around customer experience. And CX is simply the way in which a business engages its customers. So it's all the communications, whether it's meetings, phone calls, emails that happen between you and the customer or the potential customer. And customer experience is as much about feelings as it is about those things that happen. So it's really about how a customer feels about you as a brand. And that really indicates their likelihood, or it changes their likelihood of whether they will transact with you or not. If the process is frustrating, if the comms is poor, they're far less likely to want to become a customer of yours. And those feelings are long-term. So if a customer engages with you and there isn't a functional fit, what they're looking for isn't what you do, that's then sort of pushed out of the process for that particular requirement. If they have a bad experience with you, they will remember that for a long time. So how do you measure customer happiness? Well, you might have a gut feel. Your team members, your sales team, if you pointed a lead, they might be able to say, oh, I think this customer's happy or unhappy. But of course, that comes across as a little bit unreliable. You might have an annual survey with a net promoter score in it, or even a monthly survey where you ask clients if they're happy, but it's laggy and it can sometimes be biased on the current experience versus everything the customer's ever experienced. And of course, the reality is that measuring customer happiness is focused on just the customer's happiness and not your ability to deliver happiness. So to kind of tackle this, we've created a mechanism and a metric that we call rebrix CXH. And I want to talk about that in a bit more detail, just so you can see if it's useful and maybe you can replicate it in the ways that you work. So this is an example of how our metric works. This is a timeline of events And it starts on the left-hand side with something that the customer does. So in this case, they speak to or talk to or chat to the virtual agent that's on the website. What we can do is use natural language processing to determine the sentiment of the messages that the customer sends to us. So in this case, we can see that they're pretty neutral. So there isn't much of a change in the customer experience score. The sales agent gets a viewing request, real positive message from them. That's great. But then something happens. The sales agent does not turn up for the viewing. What that means is that the customer experience score decreases. It's obviously a negative thing to happen, and the virtual agent then gets in touch with the sales lead and asks them if it took place. They say no, it didn't. They're very unhappy. They put time aside for this. The sentiment from that message is negative, and therefore the CXH goes down. That's flagged to our clients, and they speak to the agent, who obviously calls the customer and apologizes. The transcript, the recording of the call, we scan for the sentiment. On the agent side, it's positive. The customer is still really frustrated, and it's negative. The viewing takes place. The agent sends the lead an SMS. The sentiment from the agent is positive. So if we look at that and we try and work out who's happy and who isn't, it's quite a difficult thing to do. There's some negative points, there's some positive points. Is this a lead that's troubled and that we should put time into? Is the agent terrible at their job? You know, what is the outcome of this? Well, the scoring that we get from this, you can see on the right-hand side. So the agent has an average score. So in isolation on this particular lead, this is average but not troubling. If an agent has average scores across lots of leads, then that's you know, a challenge for that individual. But on the customer side, we can see a customer who has an extremely low CXH score. And what that means is if this customer is valuable to our clients, it's time to step in and have a manual conversation and turn this particular customer around. And this is all done automatically in the background. It's within a platform that we've created, and it means for all of our clients, they can truly understand which customers are happy and also which agents or teams of agents are driving or not driving customer happiness. And this data is useful on a number of different levels. So you can see lead level data, and on the example on the left-hand side, these are all sort of dots of leads that are happy, neutral or unhappy. You can also see team level data. So which teams are helping drive customer happiness or not. And ultimately, you can see company level data. So as a business, are we helping to make our customers more happy or less happy? And what is the trajectory of us as a business? Are we getting better at customer experience? So I wanted to end by talking about how you create a change roadmap, which I felt was a really fancy set of terms. And actually, there's a more simpler way of looking at this, which is how do I change things without needing board approval or senior people's approval? Because what we know from working with our clients is that if change is so significant that you need board approval, it can slow the process down. And actually, there's a reason why you don't want to do that, and you want to take a more light touch approach to it. So the question of why would a business want to change? Well, from a business point of view, it's around efficiencies, better performance, more revenue, your position in your market, and your ability to convert leads. On a personal basis, there's a lot of similarities on why you as an individual would want to push change in a business. The main difference that we see is it's about your position within the company. So it's about your ability to demonstrate that you're an outstanding employee, that you have the company's best interests at heart, and that has a positive impact on your career. What we suggest with clients, and this is the way we work with some of the bigger changes that we want to deploy, is that you take an MVP approach. So this is a minimal viable product approach. It's often used in startups, and it's been created because the risk of doing a big project is always significant in terms of budget and in terms of time. Even if the time and the budget is relatively small compared to the scale of the business, you still could have spent that money and that time on something different. So the MVP approach is simply to forget about the end goal and the end result of this big solution, and instead think about steps on how you get there and how you create something that is, a basic bare bones solution, but is sufficient enough to function and also not harm the brand. So it's about focusing on off the shelf rather than building in-house. That's going to help you with budgeting decisions because it's probably going to be 10 times as small. And it's also about accepting that imperfect is okay. So having something that is tight and compact and will give you data is good, versus having something that satisfies everything everyone in the business wants to do when they hear that you want to launch something that's really cool and technology focused. And what's key is to gather data during that testing process to understand if the thing that you've launched is actually working in the way that you'd want it to. So just to give you an example, let's say you wanted to deploy a virtual agent. You're going to split that into stages. Pop down in simple terms, what are the aims of that stage and what are the KPIs? So in this case, the aim is simply to understand if customers will engage with a virtual agent, what percentage of people do that, and how well can the agent respond to customers. Underneath, I've put what would be the aim for the entire project. And this is far more wide-reaching. So this is to create efficiencies, improve customer experience, and all these big things that we want at the end of the process. But this stage is not about that. It's about just understanding if someone would actually engage with it and have a conversation with it. And lastly, when we look at the stages that will get us to that much, much bigger, and fully functioning virtual agent, this is how it could look. So it's split into 3 stages. We pop down the build time just so we can understand how long each stage is. We also put down the KPIs on the right-hand side, and then a description, which is actually really important because it's the description that stops scope creep. And it stops people coming in and saying, okay, great, could we just add this feature and this would be amazing. You can always draw them back to this process and this roadmap and that description and say, this is how we're going to run it. So once we've got through stages 1, 2, and 3, I'd absolutely love to explore some of the additional features that we can add to. The bigger challenge for innovation, I think, especially when it's kind of smaller projects, but ones that could take up time, the bigger challenge is stopping that scope creep. If individuals in the business get really excited about it, you see that as an amazing thing. You've got buy-in from stakeholders and above, but that excitement also comes with feedback and ideas that you may feel inclined to absorb because they're coming from the C-suite or similar. And keeping it protected and having a tight and compact roadmap is really important for testing. And ultimately, if you test 2 or 3 things, some of those things are going to fail, some are going to work, but at least on the failures, you knew or you found that out quicker, and it allowed you to deploy that resource and that time and that budget on other things. So that's the end of my presentation. I know I went on a little bit longer than what I expected, but I really wanted to kind of cover off all those slides and give you a view on where we felt the market is going. I'd love to open the floor for any questions you've got. So if you want to unmute and ask any questions, I would love to answer them. Brilliant. If there are no questions, I will bid you all good morning, and thank you very much for attending the session and being part of it today.